Hi, thanks for tuning in to our Practical Nerds weekly podcast. I'm Shubh, and together with my partner and co host Patrick, we normally invest in founders in design, construction, renovation, and logistics technology. Many of our friends in the ecosystem wanted us to start a podcast on the built world, and in return, we decided to honor their request with a show about nothing at all. Hey Patrick, we're back again with a brand new episode. How have you been doing?
Doing great. How are you?
Can't complain. I'm always in a good mood when we're in our lovely when I'm in our lovely office.
Yes, that's why you're there so often.
Exactly, exactly. You read my mind.
Yes, and so today we're again bringing a whole bunch of nothingness, but about an interesting topic.
Yes, and the fascinating thing is it is a process which is so important to us and actually extremely important and integral to the process of any VC worth their salt out there as being like a core staple of their diligence process. And yet there is so little information out there online to the extent that even we quite often get asked from founders about how the process actually works, to what level of detail does it need to be, etc. So we thought we'd cover this topic here, and the topic is on reference checks.
Aha, that's the process. Okay,
Yes.
so perhaps set the stage, Shub, reference check, because if you're not hailing from venture, perhaps this is the first time that you even hear the word reference check. Um, Define it for me. What does it mean in the context of a founder meeting a VC?
hmm So the core premise is as follows. So a founder makes a lot of claims, presents a lot of information, data, material out there. The claims and the information may be about themselves, who they are as individuals, who they are as professionals, what they've done in their past, maybe academically, professionally, etc. What their product or solution represents to clients. They may make claims that it these clients use it for certain value, pay them a certain amount of revenue, derive certain benefits, or they maybe have replaced competitors into using the firm solution, and so on and so forth. What we certainly always do, and what again most good VCs will do, is not take these claims at face value. Even if the founder is extremely credible on paper, there's no reason to doubt these claims, but it's just good practice being diligent, and it's a matter of hygiene to just have other people also back these claims and these statements up. So reference checks is essentially a VC, or in this case us, we'd speak with other people to verify the claims made by the founding team. So, in other words, if it's a customer reference check, we'd speak with a few customers the business interacts with, and we'll get into more detail because just saying customer reference is not enough. Sometimes it's a supply side customer, sometimes it's a demand side
Yes.
customer as well. So, there's more nuances to that than just a basic customer. So, we speak with some of those to actually verify the claims and to see how legit the claims are. Then we would speak with professional references, for example, people who have known the founders in their professional or personal capacity. And then we'd also do investor references. That is, if it's a company that has raised money from investors before, speak with some of their investors to get a download.
Right. And I always like to explain to founders who, most of the founders will know the concept, will have gone through a similar process, perhaps in past companies, but it can be new. And so when it's new, the way I describe in one sentence everything that you've just so eloquently laid out is, hey, I'm trying to gain a 360-degree view. I'm
Mhm.
trying to get a perspective from everyone that is involved with you. Of course, it's in the end still samples, but I'm trying to get from all the different perspectives a 360-degree view. And it's not because, I mean, just to double underline what you said, it's not because we're doubting what someone is saying. It's
Mhm.
because we're all having biases. And
Yes.
it's all also before we're shareholders, before we're partners, we're not sitting in the same boat just
Yes.
yet. Once we're in the same boat, we'll treat each other with high level of transparency usually. Now,
Mhm.
before that, the incentives are not entirely aligned, and
Yes.
so that's the due part of the diligence. And so that's the 360 degree, or the reason for the 360-degree view is not because we're doubting you, but because there are certain biases and there's certain incentives. And so that's what you're working through. So Shub, we're having these three types of references that we want to talk about: the customer reference, the personal reference, sometimes also called the founder reference, and then the third one could be the investor reference.
Mhm.
There's a fourth one that very, very rarely, but occasionally it does happen, and it's a so-called employee reference. We can
Mhm.
tackle that as a bonus.
Yes.
So why don't you kick us off with the customer reference, including, like you said, that can also be a supplier? Why don't you set the scene here?
Yes. So, look, what we mean by customer references is basically a stakeholder or a firm that, in most cases, is someone receiving a product or service from you. But depending on the model, and especially in construction, it can get the business can get intertwined with many different stakeholders, all of
Right.
whom participate in the value chain. And therefore, quite often, just speaking with the end recipient again is an incomplete picture. So, to give you an example, if you're talking about a marketplace of either, say, material delivery services or contracting services, so
Hmm.
what this would mean is if you're doing a thorough diligence process, the customer reference calls should include someone who's the end receiver of the product or service, someone who's delivering, who's on the supply side, maybe a contractor, a craftsman, or a material producer, or a manufacturer, diligence on that. Depending on the model, if there are other third party providers, like, say, trucking operators, individual, like people suppliers, for example, again, you may have to do reference checks over there. If the business is more complex, as in they have slightly different supply chains for different materials, you
Hmm.
may have want to replicate that into different clients or different demand side clients as well, each for different categories of products or different business lines. And then another kind of reference check that could be done is, for example, if the business, either as a marketplace or as a technology provider, even relies on inputs from certain vendors or third party service providers. And it's very important that they maintain proper ties. So the relationship between the startup you're evaluating and the vendors and service providers is also integral to the success of the model. Then
Right.
you also would need to do a diligence check over there.
So
Uh,
giving away my customers or suppliers to a VC, that can be scary, right?
mhm,
Because you're in the end, you're very, very rarely will you be part of the call. Most
mhm,
VCs will insist on actually having a direct call.
mhm.
Um, First of all, what is the right timing? When should actually a VC ask for a reference in their process, and when should you accept that as a founder?
I'm glad you asked that. So since we're usually in this podcast, providing lessons to founders and tips and tricks, etc., maybe we'll use this as an example to even bash bad VC habits.
Aha.
So to give you an example of an example of how poorly done reference checks can also get in the way of the startup. So I know of a VC, otherwise actually a reputed name, who quite often uses the reference check process to do 1 hour long calls with customers, asking them about all sorts of random things about their dealings with other competitors, etc. And it's also been found out that all that information over 1 hour was basically to kind of boost a memo being prepared to evaluate a competitor.
What?
Yeah, I'm again, obviously we can't take names over here, but and it's not just one company in the case of that particular VC. It's corroborated across multiple firms that I know.
And that's a reputed name.
Yes. So yeah, so there you go. So just to give you an example, yeah, which is why as founders you should also understand that the reference process by itself also needs to be managed properly. If done well, it can actually enhance your reputation and relationship with clients, because they know that these are the kinds of respectable investors you're going to be raising money from, probably. But if done poorly, you can also come across as a very shabbily run company, and it may hamper your prospects, and you may be giving away too much information. So, coming back to what you said about the sequence. So, first things first, it would be a red flag if a VC requested a reference check very early in the process, say before the first meeting or within the first two meetings happening. they want to do client reference check, that would be super weird.
You're speaking about customer references now.
Customer references,
Yes.
exactly.
Okay.
Right. So a customer reference would usually be something happening very close to the end of the process.
Right.
Depending on the kind of the VC, it may be happening either just before or just after the VC.
Right.
I personally am not a fan of doing customer references after the investment committee process. It feels very incoherent to me in terms of a decision making flow. But I do know quite some VCs do that. For us, what we do at Fundamental is the customer references form an integral part of our decision making process and to validate our hypotheses, which is why we like to do it leading into the investment committee decision. So usually it'll also be one of the last steps we do.
Exactly. So you do them. I think most VCs that are worth their salt will do them before the IC, but just before the IC,
Hmm.
for several reasons. The two most important ones will be that, hey, actually, after I have done a ton of diligence, will I be able to ask the right questions
Yes.
to a customer? And that requires me to put in a lot of work. Now, for a sector specialist, theoretically, oftentimes they will be able to do it quicker just because they have so much routine in your market and in your model
Yes.
that they will probably be able to have the right questions way, way earlier.
Hmm.
So for specialists, that reason might actually not exist, but for generic investors, that will actually be a good reason to do it late.
Hmm.
So that's one. And two, you really only want to tax the customers and the customer relationships of the founder when you already have gained a high conviction level. You have perhaps done also a little bit of socializing of the opportunity within the VC team,
Hmm.
and you're getting generally good vibes that based on the experience of the partner, ideally it should be a partner doing this
Yes.
with you, they can kind of gauge, okay, I have a good chance of bringing this home now, and
Hmm.
that's, of course, I will still need the insights, but
Yeah.
I'm also not doing it as a long shot checklist kind of thing. So
Hmm.
I think that's very important in terms of the customer references. We saw a lot in 2019, 2021, US funds that postponed the customer reference, and they even tried to entice founders into, hey, please do a process with me. The
Yes.
customer references we can do after the IC. So it was almost like this sales type argument.
Hmm.
That I would tell every founder that's actually a red flag,
Yes.
because that means you're not really dealing with a VC that is trying to maximize conviction, and
Hmm.
you want to have a partner on board for the next 5 to 10 years that comes with a lot of conviction, because they are the people that will stand by your side. They will put money. They will back up your decisions through the adversity. It will not be a sunshine
Hmm.
only type of investor. And for that, they need to have the ability to build conviction. So when someone tells you that, actually, I would not continue the process, because that's a sales type
Yeah.
VC and not a conviction
Yeah.
type VC.
My complaint with that happening in between 2019 and 2021 is that unfortunately it also created a cohort of founders who also then come around and say, hey, you know what, I'll only offer up customer references once
Yeah,
you give me a term sheet.
yeah,
Which at least in my mind is extremely problematic because it's kind of backwards, because to get to a term sheet I need to do references, and now you're asking me to do that, so it breaks the logical flow,
yeah.
at least in our mind. And sometimes it's a bit odd to convince founders that actually it doesn't make any sense from our
In
standpoint.
fact, I can already read into that, if that's what a founder promises me or proposes to me, that I am not really considered as the preferred partner, or even
Yeah.
perhaps near the preferred partner. It tells me that, hey, actually, I'm being considered here as an
Hmm.
also runner, etc. It doesn't happen
Yeah.
often, but when it happens, that's what I know,
Hmm.
right? So then it's like a giveaway.
Hmm.
Shub, let's bring it into the construction tech context, because about customer references, supplier references, partner references, this whole type of reference, there is a lot of specificity actually to the construction part
Hmm.
of it. Perhaps walk us through what those will be.
So I think the first specificity we already laid out. Typically, there are more moving parts, more stakeholders involved in construction tech firms than
Right.
your average startup. So to get a full 360-degree picture, you know as a VC you need to speak with more, and therefore as a founder you need to enable these references, which also of course means, hey, do a good job at building solid relationships through your entire value chain. Before we go into the details, I think that would be my first tip. Just make sure you have solid relationships with your clients and your stakeholders and your suppliers, and don't present lofty claims, because that's the first thing which will fall apart when we do reference checks.
Right.
In the sense, don't overstate what you do for your clients, don't lie obviously, and don't misrepresent stuff, because usually clients, it doesn't happen too often. I'm trying to recall, maybe in my career it's happened 2 or 3 times at most, where a client will say, no, this is not what's happening, etc. It is rare, but obviously when that happens, it's kind of game over as far as our interest is concerned. So just make sure you don't do that. Now, in terms of the construction tech nuance, so the one weirdly and fascinatingly different aspect is there's a lot of blue collar component to the reference check, and this manifests in few different ways. So
Yes.
first, the person who's been assigned to do the reference check may not be familiar or fluent in English, or whichever is the prevailing white collar language, right?
Happens to me a lot. France, Spain, Italy, a
Yeah.
lot.
So even in the markets I cover, for example, quite a few of them don't speak English. So we have to switch to a different language. So if it's in India, for example, quite often I have to take over, and even though I have like a fabulous team supporting me, it's me who has to do the reference call, simply because they're not comfortable, or maybe not even capable of speaking English. I think that's one interesting aspect, and I would imagine in the US, perhaps a lot of them are Spanish first
It
in
can
terms of the
happen
proficiency.
depending on, for example, if you have like, let's say, the references that you want to provide are actually the not the contractor owner, but imagine it's an SMB contractor, and the reference is actually an installer type
Mhm.
user. Yeah, in parts of the US, that will absolutely be reality.
Now, for some of our listeners and viewers, they may be like, "Hey, come on, are you seriously telling me they don't speak English?" So the point that we're trying to make here is not that they don't speak English at all. The objective of the reference, of course, is not just to have a conversation. The objective is to have a technical grade conversation about the business, right?
Yeah,
So you cannot expect to have that level of a conversation with someone who's maybe has only basic knowledge of English,
yeah,
for example.
yeah,
So you need to deal with them in their mother tongue, or whichever language they're comfortable in using technical terms. So
yeah.
that's what we are basically referring to here, which, like it or not, it's a reality in construction.
Now, this in the enterprise segment of construction, we will not run into that issue
Mhm.
there. The lingual, let's say, challenge is not there. Here's another one though. So when you deal with the medium size and especially the small size segment as
Mhm.
customers or suppliers, they will not actually be at their desk at the times when a
I'm
VC
glad you
would
brought that up. That was
typically
going to be
call.
my second point. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So I don't know if you've faced this, Patrick. So quite often it's impossible to do video calls and stuff like that, or send them calendar invites. So none of that
Yeah.
works. So
Yeah.
they just say, hey, you know what? I might be available in this range. Just WhatsApp call me or something like that.
Exactly. Here's my number. Call me.
Yeah. So
And
that's
then
how.
they will pick up and say hello. And you're like, well, this is Patrick from Fund what?
Yeah.
So
Exactly, exactly. I mean, in some ways, I find it also refreshing, because uh, usually what happens is, because these are field professionals, or when I say field, it could be outdoors or it could be in a factory somewhere.
yeah,
It's usually not like a white collar environment where there's like a prepared speech in front being delivered to you. So it also feels very authentic, at least to me. It doesn't feel like it's a choreographed statement being presented to me. So it feels very real and in the
exactly.
moment.
And I have heard from friends at generic VC funds that they actually struggle with the references of this kind because it requires a certain routine, it requires a certain empathy, it requires a different approach to a reference check where you need to set context, but you
Yeah.
need to do it extremely short,
Yes.
extremely quickly,
Yes.
because these people are literally, when they talk to you, they are on the shop floor or they are
Yeah.
on a client side, they are delivering business and they're taking 10 minutes out.
Yeah.
While when you do a white collar kind of reference, you might be a 30-minute meeting in between
Yeah.
30-minute meetings. So it's very, very different,
Hmm.
actually. And sometimes I cannot get them at those times at all. Sometimes I literally actually have to agree with them to talk at 9 p.m.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up the aspect of time. For VCs, and good founders will also check what the expected duration of the call is. A good sort of range to aim for, or what would likely the duration of the reference call would be, I think, in the ballpark of 10 to 20 minutes, usually on the shorter side, in the 10 to 15 minutes, which also means that the VC needs to be well prepared on what questions they're asking. So you
Absolutely.
cannot waste a ton of time with like generic introductions and like pleasantries and uh, platitudes, all sorts of things of that sort. So usually you lose the client and their patience.
Weather, am I right?
Exactly. Exactly. So
Yeah.
you need to get straight into it, and which also means as a VC you need to know your stuff and be prepared. So
Which goes back to if I do it too early and I don't know what questions to ask, actually I will make myself as a VC in that moment look foolish, but more
yes,
so I will actually harm in the name of the founder or the startup potentially.
yes, exactly. Um, Yeah, I think one aspect that I wanted to inject later in our discussion, but maybe now is as good a time as any. The whole reference process, and we've referred to the reference check process as being 360 degrees. Keep in mind, the best founders also should routinely do, but even the other founders should also do reference checks on the VCs themselves,
Fantastic point.
right? And I bring this up in the context that, so what happens is, when VCs ask reference checks for customers, most founders don't care. Okay, how long will you be speaking? What do you want to learn? All of that stuff, and they don't know how the calls even went. They kind of There's no 360-degree aspect to this. It's kind of just
Right.
randomly. It just keeps rolling along. I think what you can also do, I find it very interesting. The best founders even circle back to me after I've done the customer ref checks to ask me, hey, is there some feedback based on what you gathered where I can improve upon?
I get that rarely, very
Okay.
rarely.
So I don't get it as often as I would like, but I get it every now and then.
Okay.
And I see it as a sign of great maturity, and I find it odd that it's as rare as it is.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I thought I'll put that in there. And yeah,
Have you had a funny anecdote about a customer reference? I have one.
go for it.
So I have one where a company was somewhere between 12 and 18 months old,
Mhm.
somewhere. I can't remember exactly, but they've been around a little bit. They had a product, they had a business, and the founder told me, also the numbers of the business. And then I was asking for, hey, what references can you connect me to? And he gave me initially one.
Mhm.
Didn't give me more, but that's sometimes not alarming in itself, depending on how much time passes, because typically the founders also want to call the customer and set them up and
Yes.
make sure that they're comfortable. And so he gave me the first one, and I thought it was like the first one in a series of three, four, five that I asked for, drip feeding me.
Mhm.
So it stayed at the first one, and the first one was his brother. I only found that out
Oh,
over the call, and then the brother was even, yeah, of course, it's a good product, but I'm not sure what to do with it other than it's just good. And that was like a very, very weird instance. As you can imagine, that's not
yeah.
really conviction maximizing, and nothing else came after that, right? So that was a bit poorly managed and it's a lost opportunity really on the founder part, because these references also, the way they can go is if these customers bang the table for you,
Mhm.
not in a marketing sense, because there are ways how you can actually peel the onion with customers that cannot be prepared.
Yes.
So there's always ways how, if you're doing your job well as a VC, you will get to the true situation and the true feelings. But if those, after the peeling the onion, go very well, you have just maximized my ticket. I want to go maximum check
Yes.
on this kind of company. So actually, it's a lost opportunity if these. It's not like, hey, let me make sure they are checklisting and then moving across the finish line. No, actually, I can maximize their check. I can maximize their valuation by
Mhm.
making these references go like boom.
Mhm. But you know what? When I combine funny with reference checks, I think I have to transition to the other reference checks that we speak of, which is the investor reference check.
Okay, then let's do investor reference check, and then we'll finish up with founder references.
Let's do that. I think so. I think I've had a few examples there, but before we go there, what is the investor reference check, Patrick?
So investor reference check is something that I think we get to do every now and then,
Mhm.
but oftentimes we also lead the very, very first round
Yeah.
when there's no investor around. So we're probably not the most extensive source
Yes.
of information on how an investor reference check will go, because oftentimes we're on the receiving end. And
Correct.
what that means is that a prospective investor diligencing your startup would request to, or sometimes they wouldn't even request because perhaps they know the investors. They would reach out and
Hmm.
say, "Hey, can I talk to you about that business?"
Yeah.
And so very similar to the customer reference, but the questions are different. They are oftentimes about how do the founders actually steer the company, how are they working with the investors, what have you noticed that they can do better? So the customer reference will oftentimes be about the product, the value of the product, the distribution,
Hmm.
um, uh, and sometimes it can be also about the experience working with the company. The investor reference will be a lot about the experience of working with the company, the way
Hmm.
the management works. And it can also be about strategic aspects, market aspects, thesis aspects that will typically be sprinkled in as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I think here, what everyone is really seeking is alignment on all the facts, alignment on the round being sought or the terms being sought, alignment on the working styles between parties, what sort of allocations have been firmed up, etc. Things of that sort. That is usually what people are seeking alignment on, as well as obviously good, bad, and ugly of what the investor rates the founders.
When I get to do an investor reference because I'm not investing in the first round, sometimes it could be because there were angels before us. Sometimes it can be because we're leading a seed round and there was a pre-seed round. So every
Mhm.
now and then I get to do it, but most of the times I will be on the receiving end. When I get to do it, I prefer to speak to people that I already have a relationship with when
Yeah.
that is possible, because people I do not have a relationship with, it's just so much more likely because the
Mhm.
incentive between the existing investor and the new investor is so tilted,
Yeah.
it's so disparate. It's just so much more likely without the trustworthiness of an existing relationship that I get fed a narrative.
Yeah.
And so for me, whenever I have the option, I will always choose the existing relationship and call upon that capital. How about you?
Exactly the same. In fact, my pet peeve in this whole thing is too many investor reference checks that I have to do, as in where I'm the one asking the questions, feel like sales pitches.
Yeah.
And that is where I find it very hard to get comfortable with the underlying truth. As in, I feel like I'm being fed a story. And
Do you remember the funny anecdote that Adam shared with us
yes,
on a logistics type business
yes.
in the US?
Oh man.
Do you want to share it?
I can. Obviously, we won't share the name of the company or the investor involved. So what happened was our colleague Adam, who leads our effort for North America, so he asked with, so there's this company at the time it was considered quite hot, or I think it was just slightly before it was considered hot.
Yeah.
Um, and the company doesn't exist anymore, by the way. It raised quite a bit more money and then eventually shut down. But so the our colleague Adam, he asked a partner at another fund which I think had recently led a round in that company we looked at, and he asked like, hey, how they're doing, etc. What sort of scale are they, how are they doing? So then the partner replied, hey, they're killing it.
They're killing it. That was the answer.
Yeah. So
Great.
I think then Adam asked, hey, what sort of scale are they at? What sort of revenue, GMV, etc. And he was like, hey, actually, I'm not sure. I haven't caught up with them in a while, but I'm sure they're killing it. That's something, right? He hasn't actually caught up with them in a while, and yet he's sure they're killing it.
That is so exemplary of what's wrong about like investor references when you don't know the investor. Like that's literally feeding a narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's the problem. I think what I would suggest, and this is as much to fellow VCs as well as to the founders who have to connect VCs to make these reference checks, is hey, if you want smart VCs to invest in your companies and construct rounds where the probability of success and value creation increases, then treat the process also with respect and with
Yes.
spirit of transparency and intellectual honesty. If you consider everything to be a sales pitch, at some point the bubble will just burst and it'll not really amount to anything for you.
And that compounds.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to, hey, you should want VCs to actually maximize their conviction, so help them do the diligence. So if you already shortcut that in the first round, you're extremely likely to get that kind of investor on board who will then at the next round have the exact behavior that you just described because they never actually got to go into your substance in the first place. All
Yes.
they are used to is selling a narrative, and that's what will compound and will perpetuate. Because
Mm-hmm.
do you really think that a smart VC that is having this kind of call is then thinking, wow, they must be killing it? No, you walk away thinking, hey, probably they are not killing it. And that's why this guy has no clue what's going on and he needs to
Yeah.
tell me a narrative. And then the smart VCs will walk away. So you're getting
Exactly.
into a compounding adverse selection problem if you shortcut these processes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so investor references, I have to say, for me, they're probably, I don't know, the least important part of my entire diligence process.
Mm-hmm.
They are important when I want to make sure that I treat every startup like a partnership, right? In the
Mm-hmm.
end, we all so among VCs you can compete, and the next day you're cooperating. It's like the number one industry where you move from competitor to cooperator within
Mm-hmm.
a day.
Yeah.
But that also means that, hey, as long as we're not yet in the same partnership, you always have an incentive to kind of feed me a narrative, with the exception of, hey, we have a prior existing relationship and it's trusted, etc. Which means that the information I can get from this is very limited, but the one I can get is, hey, how is it working with you? How do you think about this partnership? Like, what kind of capability do you want to bring on board? How do you guys work with each other? So that is an important question, but it's not the question of whether I want to invest. It's more the question of how I want to invest with you. So
Mm-hmm.
that's why it's the least important part. The investor reference is the least important part to building my conviction. Now, and a very important one, a very, very important one, especially when the company is pre-seed, pre-revenue, pre-product, any of those three is the founder references. So
Mm-hmm.
Shub, what is a founder reference?
So founder reference, and again, this could be front channel as well as back channel, and I'll explain in a bit what that means. It's references from people who have known the founder, ideally in a professional capacity and ideally for a while, and obviously in a good way, ideally. Um, right? In the absence of that, because some of you who are maybe early in their career may be wondering, hey, but I've just had 1 or 2 years of work experience. Where do I get that from? So in that case, it would usually be someone maybe who's known you at college, maybe also known you personally, but due to some unique circumstances, perhaps is able to attest to your professional capabilities. Perhaps, for example, you
Internships.
were in a sports team together, in an
Yeah,
internship, things of that sort. Although keep in mind that's a relatively small representation in the sample we deal with. So most of the times it would be a professional reference. Um, Things to look out for here. Obviously, again, stating the obvious, hopefully you were very good at your work. Hopefully you haven't lied or misrepresented about what you actually did, right? Hopefully you were actually a good performer, etc., etc. But by the way, I have an example of a funny anecdote to report here.
okay.
Um, so, the, uh, so this is before my time at Fundamental, but nevertheless, I'll report it just because of how extraordinarily funny it was. So there was a person who, at the time, was working in one of India's largest unicorns, still is a very prominent company, and was just stepping out to start a new company. And it was deemed like, oh, this guy is. He was a senior executive there, so it was deemed like, okay, this is going to be an exciting new company. So we knew the founder of this, big unicorn, and we reached out. The guy just had one line response about this person. He's not in the top 50 percentile. That's it. That's it. There was no other response on anything else, but that's all that needed to be said, right? That's enough.
Wow.
Uh, so again, just stating the obvious, if you the taller the claims you make to us especially, but VCs in general as well, the more demanding we will be on how strong the references have to endorse you.
Yeah, I mean, you can't set the bar very high and then have your references dance limbo under it. That doesn't
Exactly.
work.
Exactly. So here as well, I wouldn't say not as funny, but I've had people claim, for example, they were the top. they've saved their company hundreds of millions and this and
Yeah.
that. And then when I do the reference, keep in mind that's a back channel reference, and I'll get to a bit what that back channel reference means. The person will tell me, no, he was actually not that senior. He was sort of a junior resource. Someone else was driving it. So it seems like a overrepresentation of what they actually contributed.
Yeah.
Again, when I hear things like that, it massively breaks trust and then makes me doubt, firstly, what you're saying, and also whether you have all the skill sets needed to execute on what
Yeah.
you want to build.
Yeah. I want to, before you come to the front channel and back channel, I just want to
Mhm.
stick on this topic for a minute, because here's a counterintuitive, or perhaps counterintuitive thing to someone. I think it's intuitive the more life experience you get. The one of the things that founders, especially I think, Shub, in the Western world, can approach the topic of founder references with is, hey, I'm gonna pick like very strong well wishers, and we agree that obviously they are going to hype me up, and they're only going to say great things. It's only like this and that. And that's how we are treating it. That happens a lot in the US. It happens in Germany a lot. It happens in France much less. But the Western world, the and I think it's not a cultural thing only. I think it's also a thing of the liquidity of the VC ecosystem and the
Mhm.
maturity of the VC ecosystem that you're dealing with. Okay,
Yeah.
that's a fallacy, because I actually I've made it a habit of telling founders when I request founder references to say the exact line that I'm about to say. I did it this
Mhm.
morning again. I said, "Hey, I am not trusting people whose motivations I don't understand, and I
Mhm.
do not trust people whose deficiencies I do not understand.
Mhm.
Not because I do not want to trust you, but because I do not understand you from a 360-degree view. If I do not understand your intent, if I do not understand your deficiencies, I will not know what I'm getting myself into."
Mhm.
Which means that, and I say this in the context of founder references, the smart founder hears what I'm saying is that, hey, don't hype these people up. Actually, I want to hear the deficiencies in these calls. That won't make me walk away.
Yeah.
That will actually make me walk towards you, because now I know what I'm getting into, and
Yeah.
also how I can be a fit for you. Because sometimes the deficiency is something that I might have an experience on, or might be able to help you. Sometimes it's not. That's also fine, right? But
Mhm.
if I have these kinds of insights, my trust level towards you will be much better. Of course, if the deficiency is he's fraud, he's a fraud, or she's very very hard to work with, or this guy has troubles with dealing any kind of co-founder.
Mhm.
Okay, there are deal breakers in here, right? But they are rare. Oftentimes, we all have deficiencies. If
Yes.
you're telling your founder references to present you in a way where like it's almost, hey, this is Superman walking over water or Superwoman walking over water, it's just not believable.
Yes.
It is not, because up until we die, we all have deficiencies that we constantly need to work on. So when you approach your founder references, actually make sure that they give me the color,
Mhm.
that they give me the flavor.
Absolutely. Actually, that maybe it's a good segue to define what is front and back channel, what are front and back channel references, and why each needs a different, slightly different approach from the VC. So front channel would be references where we request the founders to say, "Hey, connect us to people who know you." To be perfectly honest with you, Patrick, I haven't done too many front channel references in a while. My primary is the back channel, and the back channel references would be we reach out to people unbeknownst to you who we know you, or have worked with you, or are in a position to endorse you, or maybe give the true picture about you, and we'll check in. The cool thing is the in the best cases they converge, in the sense
Yes.
the moment you reach out to someone saying, hey, do you know so and so, they'll anyway confide and know that that has happened, etc., which also means there's high degree of trust, which actually is not a bad thing at all, from my perspective. um, the the reason why I trust that more is you get a more authentic flavor, and obviously if there is something which is of an unpleasant nature, you get the raw feedback, and no one
Absolutely.
feels like the bridges have been burnt. For front, so sometimes front channel is the only way out, especially for people who have very limited overlap with the kinds of people we hang out with, or let's say just fresh out of college, stuff like that. There's there's only so many channels you can explore.
Straight out of construction founding.
Also, yes, exactly. So there we do front channel, but there the nature of the questions has to be ultra specific, so that
Hmm.
you again don't get like a sales pitch, which actually comes to my brings me to my main takeaway. The more experienced you are and the more connected you are, it might be that there's nothing you need to actually do for, as far as founder references are concerned, except being a great professional and not lying or making misrepresentations to us. So
That is sometimes all you need.
yes. So and the rest will anyway. We'll do the background work for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. If your claims are fine, if you've been a great professional, if you have outperformed, you'll do just fine.
I want to put numbers now on these three categories, right, as we're wrapping up here. So we have
Mhm.
customer supplier refs, investor refs, founder refs. And then there's a fourth one I briefly want to bonus touch upon. So investor refs, I do maybe one
Mhm.
for a company I'm truly interested in investing in, and it would be usually at the tail end of my process.
Yeah.
Customer supplier refs, it depends very, very heavily on the model. There are
Yes.
always some for companies that are established. For companies that are pre-founding, we will typically already have a judgment on the market. And so it's kind of implied as a specialist that you will typically already, through the 6 or 10 years that you're doing this, you will already have it. But if
Mhm.
it's like something super specific, then actually we will do prospective customer apps. That's something that,
Yes.
for example, I recently did for a new type of materials marketplace over here in Europe, where they didn't have customers yet because they were
Okay.
literally pre-founding and in stealth mode. And so I reached out to prospective customers, right? So that's
Mm.
something that if it's that early, it can be 2, 3, or 4, maybe more if you need it.
Yeah.
If it's an established company, it's usually north of that we would request. For
Mhm.
founder references, that's where I really want the 360-degree view. If you're a super young company, if it's a pre-seed round or a seed round, it's the maximum I have done was 15.
Okay.
The minimum I'm doing is like 5 or 6.
Interesting. So for me, uh, yeah, the investor reference, sometimes it's needed. Most times it's closer to one. Sometimes two, but most of the times it's been one. Customer references would usually, the minimum would be two. The higher end could be much higher. Say if I have to put a number right now, for the 80% median scenario, I would say 2 to 6.
Hmm.
Uh, Back channel references, if I get per person one or two strong back channel references from someone who I know very well and who has my interest in mind, that is usually sufficient for me. If the intent is not clear to me, I may seek one or two more.
Yeah. And then there's the employee reference, which you won't read much about because it's just not a common thing.
Mhm.
And it's not a common thing because it's not often required. But actually, for one of my best investments, we were, after a long diligence, not entirely sure on the dynamics between the co-founders.
Mhm.
There was a language barrier
Mhm.
that we needed to overcome, and so we wanted to have that one additional data point on how they actually work with each other and not with the investors. And so that's when we requested from the founders, hey, here's the question we're having super transparently. Would you guys actually introduce us to your first hire?
Hmm.
And we can talk to her. And so they were super open. They said yes. And we talked to her, and we got to speak to her. Why did you choose the company? How are they managing? How are they working with each other? How are they working with you? And it was actually the thing that maximized our conviction when we heard it, because the
Nice.
way she described it was so genuine
Mhm.
and so insightful that it was not only, oh, we landed left or right, we landed right, and then we maximized the check.
Hmm.
So employee references, by the way, if a VC does that without your approval,
Yeah.
run, because an employee reference cannot be back channeled. Like,
Mhm.
that is toxic. You should
Yeah.
not accept any of that. It should always be with a respectful approval from the founders. It should be requested very transparently. In my case, it only ever happened once. And that means that, it really moves the needle for me, which in this case it did.
So it's interesting. So what I have done a few times is not employee reference, but ex-employee reference.
Yes, that's a great
So
one too.
yeah, so that I have done a few times, and So the interesting thing is the ex-employee reference, depending on the context in which it is used, can be used in two different manners. One is someone's moved on, you just check with them, hey, how was it like working there? So at that point, you know there's no reason for them to give you a sales pitch. The other is if it's a founder who, a repeat founder, or who was a supervisor or even the founder of the previous company where that person worked. And then you also get a raw feedback on what the person was like in their previous
Yeah.
stint.
Yeah. The best way to get great references is to do great jobs and not piss off people.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Great. I feel like we were able to cover a lot of ground with this episode. The AECS specific part really is around the customer supplier references, and for that, the VCs need to adapt their approach to process, to scheduling, to language, to the questions that they ask, the way they run the call. There's a lot of nuance specific to this industry.
Hmm.
And so the best advice here I can give founders with specific regard to the customer and supplier references, make sure that you prepare them well, that they know what to expect. It shouldn't be, hey, can you talk to this guy and that's it. It should be well set up because that's the best way that you can actually control a positive outcome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Shub, something in your next week calendar that you're looking forward to?
So I think the next week or two has an interesting theme for me. So I think quite a few of our companies are either about to raise the next round or preparing the next round, or something's coming together. In fact, in a couple of weeks, perhaps we'll have even more updates of something of a grander scale. So quite excited. I think we've been for what feels like 18 months, maybe more, in like a bit of like a state of stasis. I don't know if that's like the right term to use when it comes to follow-on rounds, growth rounds. I see it thawing, and I'm quite excited for what that
Yeah.
represents for the ecosystem and for us and the companies we invest in.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it's become very liquid in the last year
Yeah.
already here in Europe. And we're definitely seeing a very fast thawing in the US too.
Hmm.
On my side, I'm currently working actually on three deals that interest me. One of them is something I'm hyper interested in, which does have to do with the theme that we actually put thesis out there, you and I, grid reconstruction. So
Yes.
it's a company in that space.
And if you're interested in checking our thesis out, I think it was episode 13, if I'm not mistaken. So must be 13 or
I'm
14. Yeah.
Donald Trump now actually told CBS that he's not wanting to, sorry, ABC, that he doesn't want to come online if they do real time fact checking him. So I'm not going to do that on you. I'm
Okay.
just going to assume that
I,
that
I I think
episode
I'm
is the
reasonably
number.
confident it's episode 13 or 14.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you, Shub, and I wish you a wonderful weekend.
I wish you the same, sir.
Cheers.
Bye bye.